Imagine a single company that had its own army, its own navy, its own prisons, its own currency, its own laws. A company so powerful, it could declare war on foreign nations and win. Now imagine that company was worth $7.9 trillion in today's money. That's more than Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Google, and Tesla combined. You've heard of those companies. You buy their products, you use their apps, you wear their logos. But this company? Most people have never even heard its name, and yet it quietly ran the world for over 150 years. Today, we're going back 400 years to the rise and fall of the most powerful corporation in the history of humanity. This is the story of the Dutch East India Company. By the way, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to the channel. It really helps me out. Now, let's continue. It's the year 1600. The world looks nothing like it does today. There are no planes, no internet, no global supply chains, just vast, dangerous oceans, and months of silence between continents. And yet, there is one thing already driving global demand: spices, pepper, nutmeg, cloves, cinnamon. To the people of Europe in the 1600s, these weren't just flavors. They were medicine. They were status symbols. They were worth more than gold. The problem? Spices only grew in one place. The Spice Islands, a tiny cluster of islands in what is today Indonesia, thousands of miles away, across some of the most dangerous seas on Earth. And for centuries, the only people who controlled that trade were the Portuguese and the Spanish. But then, the Dutch got hungry. In the late 1500s, Dutch merchants started sending their own ships to the Spice Islands. Some voyages returned with enormous profits. Others, complete disasters. Ships sank, crews died, companies went bankrupt, and the competition between Dutch merchants was actually hurting them. They were undercutting each other, driving each other out of business. So in 1602, the Dutch government did something nobody had ever done before. They forced all the competing trading companies to merge into one unified super company. They called it the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, or as history remembers it, the VOC. And right from the very start, this was no ordinary company. The Dutch government gave the VOC a monopoly on all trade between Europe and Asia. Not just trade advantages, not just tax breaks, a total monopoly. Anyone else who tried to trade in that region could be arrested or killed by the VOC. And that was just the beginning. See, here's what makes the VOC unlike any company that has ever existed, before or since. The Dutch government didn't just give them a trade monopoly, they gave them the power to build forts, to sign treaties with foreign governments, to print their own money, to establish their own courts and sentence people to death. And most jaw-dropping of all, they gave them the power to raise their own army and navy. At its peak, the VOC had 40 warships and 10,000 soldiers on its payroll. Private soldiers, corporate soldiers, fighting wars on behalf of a company. Think about that for a second. A company, not a government, with its own military controlling sea lanes, conquering territories, and dictating terms to kings and sultans. They didn't just trade with Asia. They colonized it. Cities were built in their name. Islands were seized by force. Entire populations were brought under VOC rule, growing spices for the company under brutal, violent conditions. This was a corporation that functioned as an empire. And for over 150 years, it was arguably the most powerful institution on the planet. Now let's talk money, because the numbers here are obscene. At its peak in 1637, the VOC was valued at 78 million Dutch guilders, adjusted to today's money. That's approximately $7.9 trillion. Let me give you some comparison points. Apple, the most valuable company in the world right now, is worth about $3 trillion. The entire GDP of the United Kingdom, one of the world's largest economies, is roughly $3 trillion. The VOC was worth more than 2.5 times that. It was, by any measure, the wealthiest private institution in the history of the world. And here's something almost nobody talks about. The VOC also invented something that the entire modern world runs on today, the stock market. That's right. In 1602, to raise the money needed to fund their massive operations, the VOC became the first company in history to issue public shares. Regular citizens could buy a piece of the company and receive a share of the profits. They created the Amsterdam Stock Exchange, the world's first stock exchange, the entire concept of investing in companies. That started here, with spices, with the Dutch, with the VOC. Every time you check a stock price on your phone, you're using a system the VOC invented 400 years ago. But history is never just one story, and the VOC's story has a very dark side. The wealth and power of the VOC was built on violence, exploitation, and slavery. In the Banda Islands, the only place in the world where nutmeg grew naturally, the VOC didn't just want to control the trade, they wanted to own the islands completely. So in 1621, VOC Governor-General Jan Pieterszoon Cohen ordered a massacre. Dutch soldiers, along with Japanese mercenaries, killed or enslaved nearly the entire population of the Banda Islands, an estimated 15,000 people, so the VOC could seize the nutmeg plantations for themselves. 15,000 people for nutmeg. The VOC also operated one of the largest slave trading networks in Asia, transporting enslaved people across the Indian Ocean to work on plantations and in households controlled by the company. This is the full picture of the VOC, extraordinary in its ambition, revolutionary in its financial innovation, and brutal, deeply, horrifically brutal in how it achieved its dominance. We can marvel at the scale of what was built. And we must also be honest about what it cost. So what happened? How does the most powerful company in history just disappear? By the mid-1700s, the cracks were starting to show. The VOC had grown too big. Its operations stretched across Asia, from South Africa to India to Japan. Managing an empire that vast before the age of telegraphs or phones was nearly impossible. Corruption spread through the organization like a disease. Officials in far-flung outposts began enriching themselves, siphoning money, taking bribes. The company's acronym, VOC, became a dark joke in the Netherlands. People started saying it stood for Vergaan onder corruptie, perished by corruption. Meanwhile, competition intensified. The British East India Company was rising. New trade routes were opening. The VOC's monopoly was harder and harder to enforce. And the costs of maintaining a private army, a private navy, and a string of forts and colonies across 2 continents? Staggering. The company started borrowing money, then borrowing more, then borrowing to pay the interest on the money it had already borrowed. By 1799, almost exactly 200 years after it was founded, the VOC was bankrupt. The Dutch government formally dissolved it on the 31st of December, 1799. The greatest company the world had ever seen, gone, swallowed by its own ambition. But here's the thing about legacy. Even when something ends, its fingerprints remain. Indonesia, the 4th most populous country on Earth, was shaped almost entirely by VOC colonization. Its modern borders, its capital city Jakarta, even aspects of its legal and trade systems trace back to VOC rule. South Africa, the VOC established Cape Town in 1652 as a supply station for their ships. That settlement grew into one of Africa's most important cities. And the concept of shareholders, dividends, stock exchanges, all of it started with the VOC. The entire architecture of modern capitalism has Dutch spice traders in its DNA. The VOC reminds us that size is not the same as strength. That power without ethics corrodes from the inside. That even the mightiest institutions built with genius and ambition can collapse when greed replaces purpose. 400 years ago, a group of Dutch merchants decided they wanted a piece of the spice trade. What they built instead was an empire, a $7.9 trillion empire that invented the stock market, conquered continents, and ruled the seas. And then it all fell apart. There is no company today, not Apple, Not Amazon, not anyone. That comes to what the VOC was at its peak. And yet, almost nobody talks about it. Now you know. If you watched so far, please do leave an emoji of a heart in the comments. And if you like this channel, please do subscribe to it. I'm hoping to reach 10,000 subscribers, and I could really use your help. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next one.